Welcome to the Realizations Podcast. I'm Andrea Gordon, your host, and I'm excited to explore the world of real estate with you. In a world where perceptions often overshadow reality, Realizations seeks to redefine what it means to be a realtor. Join me as we peel back the layers of the industry, uncovering inspiring stories and celebrating the good in real estate. Whether you're a homeowner, a fellow realtor, or simply curious, this podcast is for you. Welcome to Realizations, where perceptions meet reality. Let's dive right in. Welcome, everyone, and welcome to Daniel Hershkowitz, who is a wonderful risk management. Actually, Daniel, what is your exact title?
Yeah, I appreciate that. Hi, Andrea. Very glad to
Hello.
be here. Let's start with that.
Yeah.
I'm the Director of Risk Management for the agency. And I think my title actually says Senior Director of Risk Management - California for the agency.
Awesome. Awesome. And I know you as Mr. Dantastic. So Daniel and I worked together at Compass before he went to the agency. And I was always incredibly impressed with how cogent and coherent his answers were to really interesting questions that we get as realtors. And so, Daniel, one of the things I just wanted to ask you is if you could tell us about how you got into risk management at a real estate company. I know you were a real estate agent before, and let me know how that progressed and how you ended up where you are today.
I will give you the short and hopefully somewhat amusing version. I went to law school. When I graduated from law school, I got a job with an evil attorney doing employment litigation. I then looked in what was then the real estate attorney newspaper, believe it or not, there was such a thing.
Oh, okay.
And the good people in Oakland, California were looking to add young associates such as myself. I went and pretended that I loved real estate. And the truth is, I just needed a job. And, but I did come to really like it. And so back in the day, there was a company called Mason McDuffie Real Estate. And every time they got sued, my little firm represented them. And I represented scores and scores of these agents. But the funny thing is, Andrea, I was always more interested in the property and the agent than I was in the litigation. The litigation was ugly and it was a pain in the ass. The only thing that was in the least bit fun were the depositions and the trials, and they were few and far between. It was just a horde of paperwork. And so at some point, when they offered me a partnership, I gave them my 6-month notice, and I went and got my broker's license, and I went and sold for 10 or 15 years.
Wow.
And it was during that selling and then being on the local board and the forms committee and then chairing the forms committee and then still keeping up with all the old attorneys and then being offered a job in management. And I realized, oh yeah, you know what I am? I'm a risk manager. And
Yeah.
so I am. And so my job is to teach, to problem solve, and to entertain. And so the more complicated the craziness gets out there, the more I'm needed, right? Which is sort of frustrating, right? I feel bad that I'm needed in this way, but I also feel good that I know what I'm doing and I try to bring it down to a level that makes sense for everyone.
That's wonderful. Yeah, it's such a weird terrain that we're in right now. And what an interesting path that you've taken to becoming what you are. Now, in terms of risk management, you mentioned that you're on the forms committee. That's the forms committee of the California Association of Realtors.
Yeah, so this year I am the vice chair of the California Association of Realtors Forms Committee. I have chaired in the past. I've been a member. I've been on task force. And the same with San Francisco. So I happen to live in San Francisco. I was the president of the San Francisco Association of Realtors a few years ago. I had a
Great.
Zoom year entirely because it was 2021. So
Yeah.
yeah, you know what's funny about that? Give you an idea. Here's how much money I spent on travel and expenses for the year. Ready? $65. I sent flowers to someone once, right? An administrator who was doing a great job. And I'm like, oh, we should send him flowers. But so anyhow, yeah, that was my path. And because of the NAR settlement, et cetera, I have a pretty good working understanding of the MLS, the NAR, all of those as well. And I've served on a bunch of other committees, as you can imagine.
Absolutely. And what's interesting is that when you're a president of a board, you do a ton of travel. Generally speaking, they're going to have big
Right.
meetings in Washington, D.C. and all over the place, and they travel almost weekly. One of the reasons why I was on the board of directors of the Association of Realtors in Oakland and Berkeley for 15 years. And one of the reasons I never went for one of those positions was because I'm terrified of flying and I
Oh,
didn't want to have to go.
right. Good for you.
Anyway, I thank you for your service. That is so wonderful. I mean, people don't realize what goes on behind the scenes in any of these organizations. The Association of Realtors, which protects us, helps us, keeps us informed, educates us, has different committees that work towards charitable things and work towards helping realtors have a great support system and understanding for what it is we're doing out in the world, which is extremely complicated. All these stupid lawsuits that you are hearing about would have you believe that we're just order takers who write down a bunch of stuff and then the deal is done. And that's not remotely what's involved. So, Daniel, can you, in a nutshell, and don't laugh, explain exactly what's going on with these commission lawsuits?
Yeah, sure. I didn't know we were going to go there, but what the heck? I've done it many times. So the St. Louis version, the Sitzer lawsuits, were seller driven. And the concept this is the allegations, right? So I'm just going to give you the allegations. So I'm not speaking from my own opinions as to the
Right,
truth or veracity of these things, right?
right.
But clearly some jury was convinced $5.4 billion later. The allegations were that there is a cabal of the National Association of Realtors, the MLS, the rules by which all of the realtors and the brokerages work, that together make it opaque our commission structure and make it such that there's little to no negotiation when it comes to how much we're going to offer compensation to the buyer's agent, and that buyers and sellers don't really know how that's working, and that as a result, the commissions have been increased. Now, I will say this. The reason we have these interesting practice changes, which include you can no longer make an offer of compensation in the MLS, this is actually clever from their perspective, the Department of
Yeah.
Justice, or whoever thinks that this was a cabal. What they've done is the current system, the one that's worked for a long time, started with MLSs being created not just for a repository of where we're going to learn about listings and properties to go see, but also a way to understand how much you're going to get paid as a buyer's agent. And so in the commercial world, a lot of properties are traded off an MLS. There's all kinds of negotiation and handshakes regarding commissions. And it's very frustrating for people to break in and understand, wait a minute, how much am I going to get paid here? Do I need to sign something with my buyer? That's unusual, right? What is this offer of compensation and can I depend on it? And so the very first rule for the MLS was you have to make an offer of compensation. And the very next rule was all of us members agreed that we're going to arbitrate any disputes regarding that compensation between us. And so if somebody doesn't offer us the X percent or dollars that was in the MLS, then we can bring a claim against them in our local association, and the other brokerage has to pay it. And if they don't, they get kicked out and kicked off the MLS. That system, says the Department of Justice, caused very little conversation between the buyer's agent and the buyer about the commission. And it's their position, and this part I do actually agree with them, that now by removing it and forcing buyer broker agreements, they're forcing more conversations, right? And when someone has a conversation about payment and how they get paid and who obligated to pay it, it may be that the payment structure changes. They envision some crazy smorgasbord where maybe it's by the hour, maybe you have a retainer agreement, maybe it's like I have with Supercuts where I just pay $19 a month and I go as much as I want. They want the market to control. What they're right about is the more conversations you have, the more opportunity there is to negotiate. What I like to think is that there's an opportunity to negotiate based on your abilities. And so if I'm looking for a great agent such as you, and I know that sounds like I'm blowing smoke, but I know your quality, and I know that you only have so much time. And so maybe our agreement says, hey, I'll be one of only 5 buyers that you have. and that you're going to commit to me and I'm going to commit to you, but I'm going to pay a premium. Maybe that's twice what's typical, but I'm sick of not getting the property. And that extra however many percent may be totally worth it for me, particularly if you have access to a lot of off-market opportunities because of your network, right? And so this can go either way. And
Mm-hmm.
so what I've been focusing on is, yeah, there's a lot of people who maybe discount, quote unquote, discount brokerages, and it may be a race to the bottom for them. But for many others, it may be just the cream rises to the top. And we really do have an opportunity now to show again what our worth is. So that's what these lawsuits were all about. The one in St. Louis was copied by hundreds of attorneys. And so there was a special judge that was assigned. There's now a global settlement that we're aware of. Hopefully, it also gets rid of the buyer version of these same lawsuits.
Wow. I mean, it's so fascinating to me to hear what you say about the potential for increased compensation based on this. And the one thing that I do like about the regulations that are going to come into play is that buyers will now have to sign a buyer broker agreement with their agent. And I think that's only fair in relationship to, it's always been that way with a listing agreement. And it makes perfect sense that it would be that way with a buyer agreement. I mean, as an agent who's driven people around, for 30 hours at a time and then have them go right with their brother-in-law, it's
Yeah.
nice that there'd be something in place that would, make sure that you do have compensation. But
You
I do
joke about that, but the brother-in-law happens every day. I reviewed this morning
find.
a complaint that one of our clients is, sorry, one of our agents is going to be making against another broker, right? And it was the mother who stepped in after 4 months, right? After they had gone through, seen the property 3 times, right? And then she jumped in and wrote the offer, right? Same concept.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Which leads to my other question around just risk management. A question that you'll hate that I have for you is, what are the three most unusual risk management situations that you've ever ended up in that you've had to deal with?
Okay, so just for fun, a couple of things that stand out. The phone call that said, and it's so obtuse. This is my favorite part about disclosure obligations, right? Is the sort of obtuse nature of it, right?
Yes.
And so one of the things that you get a radar for is, who else have you asked about this and what did they say, right? Have you gone to someone else and you're looking for a contrary opinion? And what aren't you telling me is another good question. But there was one in particular that stands out where the agent asked me something very obtusely about a dead body under the house. And he wanted to know the disclosure obligations. And I said, here's what I actually laughed, right? I said, okay, this is amusing because you're worried about the disclosure obligations. And as I pulled out some of the facts, the home inspector, when he crawled the foundation, believes that he found a box of bones under the house. And I said, this is not a call to your risk management guy. This is a call to the Oakland police, for the love of
Exactly.
God. And
Exactly.
then when we determine whether or not these are human bones, we can have our next conversation. So that one, then there's so many permutations of double ending, right?
Yes. Yes.
And the one that agents really have trouble with, which I really try to impress upon them, is obviously the fiduciary duty, right? And so we have a different relationship than, we don't have customers, we have clients, right? So
Exactly.
as an attorney, I had clients. It was an easy vernacular for me because it stuck the same. I'm at my sister's house right now. She's downstairs on a call with some patients, right? She's a doctor, right? But neither of us have customers. And if we refer to these people as customers, it sounds funny because it's a different connotation, right? It's
Exactly.
right. And so the point here is their interest ahead of ours. And so when you're in the middle of a listing and you decide you want to buy the house, my question is, how do we possibly do that without putting your interests ahead of their interests?
You
Right.
can't.
So is the opinion of many. And yet it seems shocking to a lot of agents. Or how about this one? They go to the house and they are on a listing presentation and they love what they see. And instead of following up with the listing presentation, they say, I'd like to offer it I'd like to buy it, and they come back with an offer. Somehow that sounds better, but no, it isn't.
No,
Right.
it's not. I've only done dual agency personally 3 times in 26 plus years, because I really do believe that it constitutes a complete conflict of interest.
Yeah.
And I would never buy a property that I am listing. It's just, that is like recipe for absolute disaster. The
Yeah.
3 times that I've done it, Daniel, have been with attorneys on the other end of the transaction who decided that they were going to rewrite all of the contractual forms because they didn't like the way they read. And I went to the sellers and went, I'm going to go insane because this person is not letting me complete my file. And I discounted my services, and it was all right. Also, attorneys are held to a much higher standard of what's that word?
We'll just go with a higher standard. I'm missing it too. I'm sorry. I'm going on 60 now. My vocabulary.
Anyway, because of the training that you receive as an attorney, you're going to be considered not like a normal consumer. You're going to be considered someone who is knowledgeable and should know, when you're reading forms, what's involved and what's possible. I did have a situation myself very recently where a client who is an attorney signed a listing agreement with another agent, never canceled it, and 3 months later signed a listing agreement with me without telling me that he had done so.
And you got to the point on the first page where it asks that specific question, and you have an opportunity to show, okay, were there prospective buyers, right? Was there another yeah, and he or she just
didn't read it, didn't do anything about it, thought that by calling the person and telling them they didn't want to sell with them, that was the end of the contract.
That's funny.
So you always have to be careful.
That's a reminder that, so I'll often see, as you can imagine, attorney drafted this and attorney drafted that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's so obvious when the attorney is not a real estate attorney familiar with our forms, right? And so half the time, all the things they draft are already in there, right?
Yes. Yes.
And so the problem with that is, did they intend to subtly change any of them, right? Or did they just not know that's already in the contract, right? And so I spent a lot of time on that. But let me just go back to your dual agency for a minute. The first ever sale that I had friends call me, and they wanted to make an offer on a very specific house in Tiburon. And I said, okay, have you seen the house? Yes. Tell me more about that. We went with this guy the other day. Okay, who's the guy? And so it turns out that the guy was a real estate agent that they had met somewhere. They toured with him one day. This was one of 3 houses that they saw. All 3 houses were listed by his mother. And that was the only houses that he showed them. They didn't have confidence in his relationship with them that it was going to be, laissez-faire, hands off. They felt as though mom was running the show here as the listing agent. And so this is 20 some years ago. I offered $3,000 for his day of showing them 3 properties, and said they do not have confidence in this dual agency representation, nor in your relationship with the mom. Here's what I'm offering. And I got a nasty letter from the mother that said, we're not going to review your offer, right? Talk about putting your interests ahead. She said, they saw it with my son. It's unfair. He needs to write the offer out. We're not going to review it unless they, as you can imagine, it didn't take me very long to find the code of ethics.
Exactly.
That spoke of this. But that's a great example, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And what reminds me, just like the attorney is held to another standard, or there's a belief that the attorney has additional information, our code of ethics also say that when we're involved as a principal, even if we're not involved as an agent, we have to disclose the fact that we're licensed to the prospective buyer or seller. And so if you're just buying on your own behalf, you have to write into the offer or otherwise disclose ahead of time that I am a licensee, which is really interesting, right?
I think it's important.
Yeah.
And part of this is just because the general public has no idea what's involved in all of these things. And the fact that we do live by a code of ethics, and that we do we study all these things very carefully. I just had to take my little ethics class that you have to take every couple of years.
Right.
And it's all pretty obvious stuff, honestly. It's like golden rule kind of stuff. But the reality is that there are people who skirt around the truth, who don't do things properly, who don't want to color inside the lines. And I think that it's important that as realtors, with our little trademark after the realtor, we're held to a higher standard. And that's something that the general public just doesn't seem to understand or know because of these lawsuits, et cetera.
Yeah, I guess that goes back to your worth. It reminds me, Congress is terrible, but I love my congressperson, right?
Mhm.
And this same concept seems to be what we're hearing, that, oh, somehow we're terrible, but I love Andrea. Oh, Dan Hershkowitz, he's awesome,
Right,
right? He totally held our hands to this thing. If it weren't for him, blah, blah, blah.
right,
Yeah.
right. So what would your best advice be for realtors who are starting out in the business, who are in this exact environment? How can they best actually prove to the world that they are doing a good job, that the job they're doing is necessary, and that they cannot be replaced by AI?
Well, I do think that they need to be hungry and curious. And so one of the things that a new realtor has a real advantage over a realtor who's been doing this for 30 years is they're not in the least bit intimidated by the idea of signing a buyer broker agreement, right? So
Right.
this is the biggest purchase that these people are ever going to make. Let's just take a couple who are working for Google. They are going to buy a $3.5 million house. They have not a great amount of money in hand, but they have tremendous salaries, right?
Mhm.
So they're going to qualify for this thing. They would actually be very skeptical of the concept that they're going to start entering into this relationship with you without something in writing, right? It would seem weird to them. What do you mean there's no
Right,
writing? And
right.
so, oh, sorry, rule number one, turn your phone off for the podcast. We'll have to remember that for the next guest. So it would sound strange to them. And what I always say is, listen, you need a buyer presentation that rivals your listing presentation, right? And
Mhm.
so just like your listing presentation may start with what is the listing agreement, I think that's a great place to start with a buyer presentation. So a new agent can always pull out the listing agreement when working with a new buyer and say somewhere someone has signed a listing agreement, some seller for the house that you're going to buy. And let me show you briefly what it says, right? And now let me
Mhm.
show you what you're going to be signing. It's a great way to
Perfect.
jump right into it. But then the question is value add. And so here's the issue. When you go on your first listing presentation, you don't have a portfolio,
Correct.
right? And so what are you selling? You're selling your abilities, your whatever it might be, your knowledge of the local area. For me, it was easy because I was a real estate attorney, so I was selling that. But you're also selling what your brokerage has done. And so look at all the red signs or the black signs or the blue signs in your neighborhood. You'll recognize them. Those are all of my colleagues. We have the blah, 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 and we did the blah, blah, blah. And so you can do that. You could easily do the same thing with a buyer. So
Correct.
let's look at the neighborhood, right? There were 36 transactions in this neighborhood last year. 14 were by my agents and my company. Several of them were off-market opportunities. And let's talk a little bit more about what that means. Well, I have a network, and on Tuesdays we meet to discuss blah, blah, blah. And Wednesdays we do this. And on Thursdays I tour all of the homes, right? And blah, blah, blah. And away you go until you have a portfolio to show them.
That's very helpful. That's really, really helpful. Well, we are actually at the end of our time,
How did that
unbelievably.
happen?
I want to thank you so profoundly for being my first guest. It means so much to me. I care a lot about you. You're a wonderful human being and terrific at what you do. And you're just a shining example of part of the complexity and the layers that are involved in doing real estate. We don't get by without having a wonderful risk manager in back of us. And it's very important. So all of this has been incredibly helpful, Dan. Thank you so
I,
very, very much.
I appreciate it, and I don't take it for granted. I really do feel grateful for the job that I have, for which I do believe that I'm well suited, but totally grateful that this is somehow where my career ended up. And I hope that this Realizations, which by the way is a great name,
Thank you.
I hope this turns into Julia Child and the French Chef, which I'm watching right now.
That's my goal. My goal.
Yeah.
I want to make recipes of real estate.
Yeah.
All
Okay.
right, my friend. Thank you so very much.
I
And
applaud you. Thank you very much.
all right, take good care.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you for joining me on this episode of the Realizations Podcast. I hope our conversation has shed light on the true essence of real estate and the people behind it. As we wrap up, I want to extend my gratitude to our listeners for their support and engagement. Your feedback drives the heart of this podcast, and I look forward to continuing this journey with you. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing to the Realizations Podcast and leaving a review. Your support helps us reach more listeners and spread our message of positivity in the real estate industry. Until next time, remember to keep an open mind, embrace empathy, and always seek the good in every situation. I'm Andrea Gordon, signing off from Realizations. See you next time.